If a game has any elements of platforming, it's very likely that the player character will have the ability to jump. Depending on the game, they may even have the ability to either double jump or glide. Jumping in games is one of those mechanics that becomes so inexorably intertwined with the experience of gaming. As I understand it, it's almost weird when a game doesn't have it. And as much as I could talk about the concept of the mechanic itself, I think I should stay focused. So today I am studying and recreating the jump, double jump, and glide animations from The Legend of Spyro, specifically the Eternal Night. There's quite a bit to cover, and much like with the previous videos I did with his walking, running, and idle animations, there's always going to be more going on under the hood if you give it a little more than a cursory glance. As I was building the script, I realized that this video is a little heavier on the mechanics and the approaches that I did instead of just raw animation methods. If you're here to learn about animation, you might find more resources elsewhere. Anyway. Before we get started, I have some fairly enlightening information I'd like to cover about the game mechanic that we'll be covering today. So this is not as simple as making a jumping animation, much like with other games that I've seen. This is not one singular jumping animation, but actually 4 separate animations stitched together. I categorize them as a launch, descent, and land. Firstly, the launch, wherein all upwards movement is generated. The descent is where the upward momentum stops, and the character enters a falling state. And then lastly, the landing animation, which is usually just a few frames. Why is this so? Why have 4 separate animations like this when I could just animate the entire jump and call it a day? Well, to understand this, we need to talk a little bit about button presses and responsiveness. On screen, I've got 2 separate pieces of jumping footage. On the left, I'm tapping the jump button and quickly releasing. And on the right, I'm holding the jump button until I reach the apex of the jump and then I'm letting go. This is not a new or a groundbreaking mechanic. I think the original Super Mario was one of the first games to do this. Nintendo's probably got a patent on it or something. Anyway, when building these animations, since Spyro's controller has this sort of responsiveness, I feel like I should animate him with that mechanic in mind. The mechanic being that when the jump is either interrupted or reaches its apex, Spyro will begin descending. Admittedly, this jump is a little floaty, but I'll discuss more of that in another video. Hint, hint. So let's talk about this. This is, I'm going to be creating an empty to drive the vertical position as opposed to animating the entire armature. This is more about specific engine use cases, but I want to talk about it a little bit just so that no one questions my methods. For this animation, I'm not going to animate the armature to follow the whole jump arc, as that can get pretty sticky if you don't do it just right. So, your natural instinct when animating jumps like this might be to either grab the root bone or the main controllers and move them up and down as you animate. Do not do this. This is not good, this is wrong, and it will lead to many, many more problems down the line if you do this. Maybe there's a way to do it correctly, and I just don't know how, but in my experience, I've never gotten that method to work. As you can see, his geometry and his bones are all up here, but if you'll notice, the armature itself, as in the object with a capital O in Blender, is still here at 0, 0, 0. It has not registered as movement, and if you were to import this into, say, Unreal Engine, this animation would fail in all sorts of spectacularly buggy ways. But it can get pretty hard to animate jumps like this if you just have them stuck in place without any motion, at least for me. So this has been my solution. I will instead make the armature a child of this empty, and then I will move the empty along the intended jump path or arc, so to say. This allows me to get a better idea of the jump as it's taking place. It just feels a little bit better while animating. I was able to get a pretty good read on the intended height from my footage, so there's that, yeah. Also, I can just modify the curve down here in the graph editor if I need to adjust the height of the apex or something. I can also disable the empty from following its animation path before export or something. That way my animations will be easier to work with in Engine. Now, since you can, modify the curve, hypothetically, you can also make a wondrous mistake like this and turn him into a flea and send him flying up into Blender's empty space, but let's not do that. I can also create multiple animations for the empty if I need to tweak more specific things, just as like hang time or hovers or what have you. I did need to do it for the double jump, so there's like a layered set of animation for the double jump, and I think I did it for the glide as well, or at least the glide where you move. Anyway, let's dive in. Okay. Amusingly, if you see the footage here, for the first frame that he's above ground, like when you first press the input button, he's actually still in his idle pose. I kept this quirk in my raw animation data because I found that it helped like sell the snap of the motion. I did not keep it as the final, but just a little something that helped the animation feel a bit more authentic while I was working with it. This is a pretty short sequence. It's only it's not very many frames. There's only about 2 main poses. Firstly being the initial launch pose, and then it looks like a moving hold up towards the apex, and it's not much different than the first pose. He's just arced a tiny bit more, like he rotates forward with his chest first and his hips follow. There's some offset in his paw positions, which are pretty easily added. I like the asymmetry that they create. And his tail has about 3 main poses within this animation. And truth be told, my animation didn't quite look right until I added these in. I didn't realize just how much his tail sells it. He flaps his wings once during this animation, which also helps sell the movement. It's a pretty instantaneous snap. It happens, I think it's like the first keyframe within the pose. Okay, on to the next portion, which is the fall. I have broken this falling sequence into 3 parts. Firstly being this continuation of this moving hold, wherein the last pose of that launch is held, tweaked for just a bit, and then secondly is the sequence where the moving hold goes into the first pose of the falling loop. And then thirdly is the falling loop itself, which you don't really see as you're playing in game, because by the time you trigger the falling loop, you're over a bottomless pit, or you've already contacted the ground, or you've been hit by an enemy. You just don't really have a chance to see it that much. There is another animation that triggers if you've been falling for a longer period, where he starts flailing and flipping, but I think I'll save this for another video, maybe. Anyway, within the falling loop, I think it's important to note that the way his head snaps back, it looks really weird when it's viewed up this close, but I think it's, like with his walk animation, it's another case of the camera being a certain distance from the player, and at a lower TV resolution, all of that's coming into play here, which is why I think Chrome made the animation choices that they made. So, the landing animation was my favorite of this batch. It's very squishy and expressive for this model. Upon making contact with the ground, a few things happen. Firstly, his chest is already a little bit closer to the ground, which creates this nice arc in his spine. Secondly, his front legs straighten out quite a bit, as well as his hind legs, and his tail curls forward while his wings remain, pretty stationary. After making contact with the ground, his chest and hips do 2 things. First, they try to become level with one another, on the same plane, and secondly, they sink much lower to the ground, especially if you compare their position to where they are in the idle pose or the initial pose upon making contact with the ground. This is to sell the illusion of energy absorption, I believe. His head is the most expressive here. There's about 3 major keyframes for it, I guess, if you don't count his spines, but that's secondary movement. First, when he makes contact with the ground. Second is during the energy absorption pose. And thirdly, I think this is quite cool. This one keyframe really sells this movement and creates this lovely snappity arc. His head stretches forward in this really dramatic way before snapping back to its default position in the idle state. I think it's so cute, and it complements the overall shape language of his model quite well. Okay, and if we put them all together, this is what we get. A lot of thought went into this animation, I can tell. It makes sense since it's one of the mechanics that the player will be using throughout the entire game. Whew, okay, now that I have these animations in place, I have a little more wiggle room to create the next sets of animations, which will be the double jump and the gliding animations. Okay, here we go. The double jump in this game is surprisingly short, but it has a few more layers to it than meets the eye. It didn't take me too long to recreate. This is what I've seen with it. I think what makes this animation so different to me is that it changes his silhouette for a brief amount of time, probably to clearly, visually communicate to the player that they have indeed double jumped. I'm going to break it down as best I can. Let's look at the easiest place to start, which is his spine. In the single jump, his spine is pretty much parallel to the ground, but with the double jump, his spine briefly becomes perpendicular with the ground before returning to, a more regular default angle. There's only about 2 major keyframes here in the spine with a few moving holds and maybe one little overshoot. Up next is his wings. There's 2 flaps for the double jump alone, and their timing is pretty critical to sell this motion. I found it easier to animate the spine first, and then animate the wings. The poses and their timing wasn't difficult per se, but it did expose my weaknesses within the weight painting for both Spyro and Cinder as I was building the animation. And, lastly, the tail, which it reminds me of a flail, the way it's moving around here and stuff. There's a few keyframes here, and since I'm essentially copying someone else's hard work, this part was pretty easy. No guesses on the timing. Each keyframe of the tail is reacting to a shift in momentum and energy in the main body. The final pose of the tail is essentially allowing it some space to transition into a more neutral pose, much like with the spine. So, of the animations that we're covering here today, I think the double jump is the most busy. It's the busiest, but it's also very short, very sweet. Okay, gliding. So when I first started drafting this video, I had a very lengthy section dedicated to the suspected programming of the glide mechanic, but I think that it kind of took away from this video because this is more about animation and not necessarily the rules and mechanics that you think of when it comes to animating for games. Anyway. Spyro has 2 gliding states. One for when the player is actively applying directional input, which is a fancy way to say pushing the joystick, and 2 for when there is no directional input applied, which is not pushing the joystick. And since I want to be thorough, I want to recreate both of these gliding animations. I've broken what I'm calling the active glide into 2 separate animations. Firstly being the transitory or the introductory state, wherein it's similar to the double jump in that his spine must transition from being perpendicular to the ground to instead being parallel to the ground. Looking at my footage, I'm not really sure if it's an actual animation or if it's a transition that's being handled by their in-engine animation handler or manager. I didn't want to chance having a weird animation transition within my NLA strips, so I just went ahead and animated it. There's not a lot of complexity in this animation. The shape of his tail settles into this more relaxed position and his legs splay out just a bit, but there's just really not that much to it. So, on to the looping sequence for this. This animation is pretty short. Being completely honest, there is quite a bit of artistic license on my end because it's kind of hard to get good footage of this particular glide loop, at least in the introduction of this game. Interestingly, it looks like there's 2 unique loops for what I'm calling the active glide loop, maybe. He starts off in almost this soft state of animation, but if the glide goes on for longer than 1 or 2 seconds, the animation transitions into a different loop. And how can I tell is that, his tail will go from almost no movement to suddenly flickering very rapidly if the glide continues. And I think they did this to sell the illusion of velocity. To sell this movement, I only had to tweak my first attempt at the glide loop just a little bit, by adding the tail flickers and like the little bits of head jarring that you might see in the original animation. It's not perfect, but I think I'm content with it. There's not really a landing transition animation for this passive glide animation. I suppose because he technically isn't hitting the ground the way he would be with the jump or the double jump. It's an interesting choice on the developer's part. Okay, big video. Feeling pretty good today. I think you can tell my energy might be a little bit different now. Yeah. That is my analysis of these animations. If you're not an animation enthusiast or anything like that, I hope this maybe will give you a little more appreciation for how much thought goes into creating a playable character. This is a lot of animations for a mechanic as simple as jumping. And you know, it's more work for the developers than me because they're the ones that had to make all the creative and technical decisions. I'm just mechanically copying them. As usual, as you could see, I took these animations and plopped them onto my Cinder model. It's a lot of fun to see her come to life like this in a way that we never saw in the original games. I think it's one thing to just give these animations back to Spyro, but it felt like another challenge to give them to Cinder as well. A bit more proof of mastery, especially since her proportions are a little different and her armature is different. So, but yeah, if you're still here, thank you so much for watching. This was quite the doozy of a study. It looks like this is going to shape up to be a very long video, or has been a long video. It took a lot longer to organize this than I thought it would. So, yeah, again, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your time, and I will see you next time. I hope you have an awesome day, or week, or evening, morning, whatever. Bye-bye.